My name is Lois Sterba, and I am a board member of the Downers Grove Historical Society. I've lived in Downers Grove for about 30 years and very interested in history. So the Historical Society was something that I was very interested in. Our society started in 1968, and our mission is to preserve the history of the past for future generations. So that's what we're doing here. One of my jobs on the Historical Society was treasurer for many years, but now I have gone to the position of historian. And as historian, what I'm doing is researching information about Downers Grove, and particularly the information about this Main Street Cemetery. This cemetery is 165 years old. I look at this cemetery as a large history book or a living history museum, because you can walk through this cemetery and find all kinds of interesting things about Downers Grove history. Back in the 1960s, they first started doing that, researching the history of this cemetery to gather all the information they could, because many of the markers have been lost and are gone, and we want to preserve all the history that we can. I've always been interested in historical societies, no matter where I lived. When we moved to Downers Grove in the 1990s, I was very happy to see a historical society and also a historical museum. One day when I walked by the museum, I walked in and looked around and was soon conducting tours of the Blodgett House on Maple Avenue. And then I also began running summer day camps out of the museum and conducting tours. I always like to introduce the history to the students in school, and as a former teacher, I'd like to include the history of Downers Grove in the curriculum of the Downers Grove Grade School District. And then as a retired teacher, I take kids, the students, on field trips, and we go visiting different historic places in Downers Grove. The location of the cemetery often was a mystery to me, but then I realized that when the people came to Downers Grove to settle here in the 1840s and 30s, they lived right around this area. This Maple Avenue that we have here was the old Indian boundary line, which was a traveling trail through the village, and many people lived on that trail to get to the east and down to Chicago. So when they had someone who passed away in the family, many of them just buried their relatives on family land, and some of the family land was across Maple Avenue to the south of where we are now. In 1856, some concerned citizens thought that it would be nice if we had a specific place for burial here. Now, Downers Grove, I like to tell you, did have a cemetery on the west side over by Belmont on the Stanley family ground, but that was quite a ways from here. And these people who lived here wanted to bury their family members closer to where they lived. So Mr. Sam Curtis, who lived on Maple Avenue, decided that he would sell 1/2 acre of his cow pasture to become the official cemetery here in this location in Downers Grove. And if you look at the land of the cemetery, it's nice and flat. We don't have a lot of flat land in Downers Grove, so you can picture this as being an old cow pasture. So in 1856, there were several graves by Maple Avenue, and they were brought over here. And then after 1856, this was officially declared the cemetery, and it has remained a cemetery now for 165 years. The people buried here range from dates prior to 1856, those who were brought here to be buried, and up until 1938, when the cemetery was then officially closed. I think the Main Street Cemetery gives us in Downers Grove a pleasant park-like green space area that is in the middle of a very busy business district. The half-acre piece of green space is walked through by many people as they're going east and west to Main Street and to the apartments on the other side of Fishel Park. And it is just an enjoyable place for people to visit. Yes, the Main Street Cemetery is very rare. The records show that only 2 cities in the United States still maintain a Main Street Cemetery because this land is very valuable. There was a push in the 1920s to remove the Main Street Cemetery and to use this land for business purposes, but people decided that they wanted to maintain this cemetery. In fact, some of the graves that were, people who were interred in graves here were removed because they were afraid that was going to happen. But the Main Street Cemetery has remained for the 165 years, and we are very happy to have it here because it presents so much of the history of past Downers Grove that we could never recreate anywhere else. It has been a challenge keeping up with the Main Street Cemetery. Anything that's 165 years old, of course, is going to suffer from deterioration. So the Historical Society and the village entered into an agreement in 1999 to restore the cemetery. We've had groups coming through the cemetery as far back as the 1960s to locate graves and to document where the monuments were and write down maps of the cemetery. But by 1999, it was evident that we needed a lot of restoration that would be costly. To replace tombstones, to add tombstones, to just landscape the area and fence the area and put a wall up. Every year we receive money from the village of Downers Grove to do that. And restoring the cemetery then became the project of the Downers Grove Historical Society. The daily maintenance of the cemetery is done by the Forestry Department of the village of Downers Grove. They cut the grass and prune the bushes and take care of the trees that are here. In researching the history of the cemetery, I found that history dates back many years. 2 graves we have in the cemetery are for ladies who were daughters of Revolutionary War soldiers. Even though they came to live here back in the 1830s, their parents fought in the Revolutionary War. So we have 2 graves there. We have a grave of Sam Curtis, who fought in the War of 1812. And fighting in the War of 1812, he was entitled to script, which was money for his service. And that script he used to buy land here in Downers Grove. So Sam Curtis bought his land here and moved here from Vermont after fighting in the War of 1812. In this small cemetery, which is only a half of an acre, we can identify 10 Civil War soldiers who served in the war. Some of them died in the war, some of them died of battle, some of them died of illness, some of them came back here to live out their lives. But in this very small cemetery, we can identify those. We can also identify in this cemetery people like Israel Blanchett, who was a blacksmith. He brought his trade to Downers Grove. It was needed for the pioneers when they were building homes and needing things of iron and to be made. And he also was active in the Underground Railroad. And we have identified several people who worked with him on the Underground Railroad who are buried here in this cemetery. I think the next generation will be in pretty good shape because the Downers Grove Historical Society on the 150th anniversary of the cemetery produced a book called Voices That Are Gone, and it is a written history of the cemetery, of the people buried here. Now, we weren't satisfied with that, so the Downers Grove Historical Society also launched an app, MainStreetCemetery.com, where you can go online and you can actually see all the people buried in the cemetery and read stories about them. Some of them are audio.
Gracie Wells was the daughter of Arvilla Bond and John Manning Wells. Gracie passed away in 1883 at the tender young age of 5. In her memory, her father worked with local officials.
Now, we were very concerned about the land here and if we are finding all of the remains. So We engaged the services of the Raymaker engineering firm of Sauk Village, Wisconsin, and they came in and did a ground-penetrating radar survey of the cemetery, and we found for us remains of all people here. Some of them we have marked, some of them we have not marked, but with their findings, we can now go back, check old records and old tombstones that might have been removed and old maps, and we can put together more of the history of the cemetery. So this cemetery will not ever be forgotten or lost because of all of the modern things that we've done to try and keep people's attention. I would hope that the next generation also feels the love of history and wants to learn about the people of Downers Grove, especially the pioneers who made this village starting in 1832, to learn about these things. And you don't have to learn just from a book. You can learn by going places like this cemetery and experience and looking at all of the historical things that you find in the village. So a cemetery is one place you're going to find history, and you're going to find it in many places in Downers Grove, but I really do hope the young generation will want to include that love of history in their life. A lot of people wonder about people who like cemeteries, like me. Well, my love of cemeteries starts from when I was a small child. My grandmother would take us at least twice a week to the cemetery where my grandfather was buried in order to put flowers on the grave. It was a very important thing. As a child then, I learned that the cemetery was a friendly place and a place to learn about relatives that I never knew or would never have a chance to have known, and history of the people. When I think of a cemetery, I don't think about how these people died when they died. I think about who they were and when they lived and what they have done for the world. Their death is not as important as the lives that they led. This is a cemetery. Lives are commemorated, deaths are recorded, families are reunited, memories are made tangible, and love is undistinguished. This is a cemetery. Communities afford respect, families bestow reverence, historians seek information, and our heritage is thereby enriched. Testimonies of devotion, pride, and warmth are carved in stone to pay tribute to accomplishments and to the life, not the death, of a loved one. The cemetery is homeland for memorials that are a sustaining source of comfort to the living. A cemetery is a history of a people, a perpetual record of yesterday, and a sanctuary of peace and quiet today. A cemetery exists because every life is worth loving and remembering always.